Hello, this is Alan Benessy, and this is Lecture 1 on the Theory of Consciousness, which is based on my book, Theory of Consciousness, which I published last year. It's a short book, only 50 pages long or so. Buy it so you can follow along with these YouTube lectures. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is really the first 4 chapters of the book. And don't be too concerned, it isn't extensive reading. That only comprises about the first 10 pages because the chapters are very short. The first chapter I won't talk about much at all. It's just dictionary definitions of consciousness, several different ones. And also my favorite definition, which is closer to the way I'm looking at things, as you'll see, is Descartes' famous quote that I think, therefore I am. Now, chapter 2 is an extremely important chapter because it presents 3 different ways of looking at the phenomenon of an entity, in this case me, changing my momentum. Now, according to classical physics, the only way an object, such as me, can change its momentum is by having a force act on it. But from my entity perspective, and that's what I want to talk about first, is I can think to myself, with my consciousness, it's hot, I want an ice cold beer, I'm going to go get the ice cold beer over behind me on the table and I'll bring it right back here. So I can stand up, choose to stand up with my consciousness. I can walk over to the table. I can bring back my ice cold beer, but I won't drink it yet. I'm going to hold off. My consciousness decided I'd hold off while I'm telling you guys about the entity perspective. From my entity's perspective, I know exactly why those particular changes in momentum occurred. I made them happen. It's obvious. That's the entity perspective. Now, if we looked at me as a single large object with a mass of maybe 80 kilograms, you would have to really invent forces to explain why I accelerated towards the table, picked up the beer, and came back. What was the origin of these forces? You could define forces. You could look at the forces in my legs, my muscles, all of that, but you really wouldn't have a clue as to why those particular changes in momentum occurred and why any changes in momentum occurred, for that matter. That is what I would call the macroscopic, mechanistic perspective, as opposed to the entity perspective where I knew exactly why I changed my momentum. I wanted the beer. Now, another way to look at it is the way I spent most of my years in science looking at it, microscopically. Atoms, molecules, macromolecules, biological molecules, cells, organs, organelles, the brain, neurons, synapses, axons, synaptic transmission using neurotransmitter molecules, action potentials zooming down axons. But if you look at those in detail, even though when you get to very small things like atoms and even molecules, really you need to use quantum mechanics in physics, but there's no place for consciousness in the whole thing. If you're analyzing what I did, you could look at every interaction that occurred inside me in my brain, look at all the action potentials going from one place in my nervous system to another, to my muscles, to looking at the muscle contractions as the calcium ions flood in and out, and the actin and myosin act, and all that stuff. But it's all as mechanical as billiard balls colliding on a table. You have no clue as to why those particular changes of momentum occurred. There's no clue. So those are three different ways of looking at the same thing. The entity perspective, where I know exactly why the changes in momentum occurred. The macroscopic mechanistic perspective, where I don't know why. Or even the microscopic perspective, microscopic mechanistic perspective, where also I don't know why those particular changes occurred at the microscopic level. So what the hell is going on? Well, chapter 3. We just covered chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3. The assertion I make, it's called axiom number 1. The entity perspective is valid. I really exist. You really exist. My dog Rocky really exists. From the entity perspective, the changes in momentum, which require forces according to physics, and they do indeed, but we'll get to that. The consciousness is the instigator of all changes in momentum. So we assert as the first axiom, the entity perspective is valid. The second axiom is that an entity can use its consciousness to change its own momentum. In other words, it create a force on itself. In fact, that's probably the best definition of an entity. It's is a consciousness that can change its own momentum. It's a rigorous way of looking at it. A consciousness may be associated with quote-unquote material objects, which we'll analyze more later, but nevertheless, that consciousness can change the momentum of the body with which it is associated. And we also know that a consciousness can change the momentum of other objects or even other entities. Rocky, where are you? Oh, he went away. Well, I could pick him up and change his momentum, and that would be an example of an entity changing the momentum of another entity. So we see that if you look at things in terms of entities, it becomes apparent why specific changes in momentum occur. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4. And this is really where people are going to go nuts, because I don't believe anyone has ever suggested this literally before. We assert in a postulate, meaning that it's consistent with observations, but it's difficult to prove or disprove. But anyway, let us assert, main principle here, all changes in momentum, in other words, forces, are caused by intelligent behavior of conscious entities. All forces are caused by entities. Conversely, one can say, wherever there are forces, there are conscious entities. And that goes at the macroscopic and the microscopic level. That is the key postulate. Those are the key postulates in the book. Wherever there are forces, there are conscious entities. Conscious entities can change their momentum and momentum of other objects and entities. And that's the key. There are different space-time realms where forces act. For example, there's inside the nucleus, there are nuclear forces that hold the nucleus together, and if one accepts the postulate that all forces are associated with consciousness, conscious entities, there must be conscious entities at work somehow inside the nucleus. Similarly, the electromagnetic forces that hold atoms and molecules together and really are the basis of humans and other biochemical systems, those forces also must be associated with conscious entities. And it does make sense, because if you've studied biochemistry and biophysics, no one comes away from that who doesn't say to themselves, it's as if these structures that make up our bodies are designed by intelligence. And indeed, that's exactly what I'm suggesting, that there are entities at work in the microscopic realms, the nuclear realm, the atomic realm, molecular realm, the biological realm, the astronomical realm, that create changes in momentum, forces. That's the key. Okay. So let me just summarize. All matter and energy is therefore inhabited by intelligent, conscious entities. And it is these entities that give rise to what we call forces, which we need to explain the behavior of what we're looking at. Another important point is that all entities, all conscious entities, are conscious simultaneously. So that the entities, for example, that make up me and you, the biochemical, biophysical entities that build us and make our molecules and make our blueprints, the DNA, and make things happen. Those entities are alive and living and conscious right now, all the time. So that's where we'll end lecture number 1, and I hope that you will bear with me and we'll stick with it, and we'll get to lecture number 2 next time.